what is the difference between inhibition, intentional inhibition, to pause intentionally, and to inhibit something that wants to keep going?
Mm-hmm.
And when is it a natural part of the rhythm that you're allowing the pause?
Yeah.
Something I'm thinking about.
Really interesting. Very interesting. And I'm curious about that as well. Because I work a lot with intentions, and I really, it's been a huge factor in my growth. It's for me, it's a bridge, and it's another thing in the toolkit. So Feldenkrais can teach me about awareness of my sensations. It can give me a whole host of philosophical and intellectual underpinning that I can bring into my day-to-day life about pausing, about being aware, how to sense myself. But I know that my intentions, me consciously setting an intention to evolve and to integrate my learning, or even like when I was in class on Saturday, that today I'm going to really intend to be to sense myself, to really be in the movement. It enhances my experience of the lesson. Hands down it does, by setting that intention. And so even if we do nothing other than just to say, I intend to pause. And I've been doing that for the last, ever since I came up with it. I intend to pause, and I do it in all sorts of ways. And I'm really, what that's doing to my whole sense. And what I'm discovering is pausing, it creates space for something else. So it links very beautifully with organic intelligence, because just pausing, and I feel there's more spaciousness to orient. I can do that, and I am doing it, but if I pause and do it, I have a sense of more spaciousness. And if I pause and do it, there, it feels like in the pause, I'm allowing new possibilities. So very often I'm doing something. So even if it's washing up, and choosing to pause, I just suddenly think, oh, I'm going to use the other hand. That would not occur to me. But a pause, it's not coming from me. I'm not forcing that thing. It is an organic thing that arises by intentionally creating a space. And I've been really playing with that in all sorts of ways. And I think that if people can play with this, number one, it's a beautiful thing, because it's for them. And it just makes life a little bit more. And also it stops the sense of that busyness and the sort of frantic energy. It's just a moment, but it kind of feels like I settle in that moment. But it's not just settling. I'm also, there's the call to action bit that calls me in a more expansive way to possibilities that I wouldn't necessarily give myself. And it feels spontaneous. It's so wide, and particularly creatively, when you're creating a piece of work, as an artist, pausing. When do you pause, but listening to breaks in music and what that does. And I even thinking about intimacy and that pause, that moment, and what that does. It's just so rich. And also the functions of pause can be very different in those various circumstances. And thinking broader, about the change and being the change and social justice, pause it saves lives.
Mhm. That transition between pausing and action is also something to explore, right? Because there can be like, when does the pause turn into a stop? and
Mm-hmm.
and when does the action turn into non-action? And when is pause, is it active or is it passive? And yes, when we have the biological function of freeze is it's a different quality, has a different quality than pausing intentionally to feel and to notice and to then respond from there with that feedback that comes in the pause.
That's really useful. This is why I feel so passionate about Feldenkrais and what we can do with that. Me, what I understand about Feldenkrais is having that real, the more we can build that for ourselves, that intentional, oh, let me notice when I'm pausing, let me notice, and let me practice, let me experiment with the pause, then that builds it into our whole being, that ability to do it.
And there's also this quality of reversibility. So you go into this pausing, slowing down, digesting, integrating, and then you reverse, you come back into movement, into action from there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it does dovetail into organic intelligence in terms of this notion of thresholds. And so in Feldenkrais, we're talking a lot about learning, and this, and how much, like, what amount of information can you take in at any one moment? Like, what's Arlen Zones used to say, like, what's the right homeopathic dose? Like, what's the right dose that then you can integrate that, and then you build on that. And it's similar with the notion of thresholds and organic intelligence. It's like, if you do too much, you go over threshold.
Yeah.
If you inhibit any kind of action or any kind of excitation, then you're not going to actually reach the point where learning can happen or change can happen. And that's for all kinds of reasons. But so we're looking for these organic thresholds where it's not too much, not too little, just right, and that it finds its own timing. And then from there you let that go and you rest, and then it can kind of create this oscillatory pattern that where there's a kind of rhythmicity to it. There's a kind of rhythm to our learning, rhythm to our expansion and contraction. Yeah.
For me personally, doing lessons, I find that my enough place is I'm quite clear about that. And sometimes it's a challenge to kind of think, oh, I wonder if I can go a little bit more. That is often the place of new learning for me. Can I do it a little bit more? What if I could do it in a different way? Does that mean it feels like I have a little bit more range in this movement? But for me, it's also that interesting thing to differentiate between tipping into the pleasure and allowing that pleasure, and tipping into a place where you're going too far with just, you've enjoyed it, it's sumptuous, it's lovely, it's, oh, I get it now, oh, it feels great, and then you overdo. But that pleasure place is an important place also, isn't it, to just really just enjoy that sense of that whole experience of being in that movement of things kind of connecting up in a way that feels really good, your whole being. So it's
Mhm.
interesting, isn't it? These it's there that it feels like there are such, almost like these tiny little spaces where one thing becomes another or could become another.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think it's that Weber-Fechner law, this just noticeable difference that we get more and more refined at sensitizing ourselves to finer and finer distinctions, so that then that range of sensing a difference becomes, we can feel it sooner. We can, our intuition about maybe this is time to pause, and that the feedback that we get there is over time more and more nuanced. And we start to trust it more, and benefit from the pauses earlier. And it's a cool thing that just keeps, as we go, it just gets, the learning and the refinement just is infinite, it seems to me.
Mm.
And then I think that's interesting, this thing about the subtle differences and the noticing and all of that happens inside of awareness through movement. And then the changes that happen on the floor, that happen in the space of learning. And then when does that reach a new threshold in terms of integration, so that experience of life off the mat changes? Where is that, these little bits of learning that add up over time in a safe environment, without a big demand, without a big having to achieve anything, and then they kind of congeal into some kind of learning that then shifts the experience outside of that context.
I mean, it's interesting because it's similar to what you're saying, is that I think the the integration and the learning is sometimes so subtle that it's I can't put my finger on it and say this is a moment where I felt completely different. I remember I can know that when I started doing lessons, I was like, I just loved it. And even lessons that I didn't particularly enjoy, I felt different. I felt things shift in me really profoundly. And I'd come out of a lesson and feel like, oh yeah, that was so good. That was worth doing. So certainly a huge thing for me was simply being able to feel myself, to feel in my physical self, was a huge deal. And not only that, but the thing that excites me so much is a real sense of wholeness. Finally, having that experience, no matter what lesson, that I feel myself as a whole being. It's not a concept. It's not something I have to read a book about or do how many meditations around or whatever. It's something that happens in a lesson that, moving my eyes will somehow, you know, affect how the whole of me moves. And that I have that tangible sense of being all connected up. Even if there are gaps, and they still are huge gaps for me around places where I don't sense so clearly. Um, strategies that I need to use to really enable myself to sense more clearly. Um, like, sometimes I have to really do things so much smaller, or sometimes I have to do it bigger just to feel it, and then pull back from that to then be able to say, oh, that I can sense myself now. I'm curious about pausing in everyday life. And so what I've been experimenting with is I do this, and mobile phones ping ping ping, and then there are moments where I go to, and I'm immediate, and I was like, and I pause. But when I take a pause, and it could be just a moment, I feel like, okay, I'm reminded that it's almost like, in not pausing, it's like there's a desperate, it's almost like it's a life and death thing, to get on with the next thing. And it sounds huge, but actually, if to take in time to notice that, it can feel really like, really a forceful thing. Whereas that pause just, almost like it takes me back into a space where, yeah, life's all right. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's okay whether this gets answered now or whether it doesn't get answered now. It's okay. And yeah, but there's a quality of settling.
I think that thing about compulsion or habit and choice is one of the first things I thought of right before you said that. Right before you named it, I was thinking about my kids, and they're like yelling for something, and my habit is like, I want to stop that sound. I want to stop that intensity. I want to like meet that need. The baby's crying, you just go right there, right? And that the timing is, as my husband has pointed out to me, is like, for me, it's very quick. So it doesn't really give a chance for my child to into any sort of space around that, and that there's this, then that becomes this expectation that like, I'm going to, make this cry. And then, we want, there's a certain amount of that you want, and probably better to err on the side of meeting the need. But I think what you said about, the phone dings, and then do you have to go right there, or can you take a moment, and so it reminds me of something I've ongoingly playing with my kids, of like, oh, I hear you, and instilling for them more of a sense of patience with themselves and their own feelings, the more that I can hold space for that, so that's like one direct thing. Yeah. And then the other thing I was thinking about is, again, this idea of these like oscillatory waves, and this rhythm of our activity or our action and our letting go, and the image that came when you were sharing, it's almost like a bunch of bell curves like piled on top of each other. It's like going from action to action to action without actually coming down from the action into this more of like a default mode network, or kind of more of like a neutral, coming back to, like in the Feldenkrais lesson, you'll do a movement and then you'll come back to neutral. You'll come back to where you started for a moment. And then before you go on to the next movement, the invitation is often to pause and let go of the whole entire pattern of action, so that when you begin again, it can be a new exploration, rather than building one movement off the other one, which already has the same wiring and patterns and muscular, configuration. And then there's not a lot of room for change when that is all going on. So you kind of, you do that and then you come back, and then you might add a layer of complexity on top of it. But in order to add the layers of complexity, it's really important to come back to that slate if you can, for as long as your own rhythm feels good, and everyone is different. And also we're not trained to listen to that in ourselves, right? So it's a practice of listening to the teacher say, okay, now pause and rest, and seeing what happens when you do that, and then learning how to do that on your own when the teacher is not saying that, when the external authority is not giving you the permission to pause. It's taking that on ourselves.
Yeah. Oh, that was thank you. That was really it gave me another level of clarity around pause and Feldenkrais. And I just think it just made me think, oh, I do that. I may not say the word pause, but I do say, just take time to let one movement go before you start another. And that's exactly the same thing. It's about having that pause. So it's how we do it in different ways.